Welcome back. Charles Kesler writes that the term conservative began to be used commonly in the late 19th century America in order to distinguish the defenders of sound money, traditional constitutional and political arrangements, from their sundry opponents such as populists, labor radicals, urban progressives, democratic tub thumpers like William Bryan. Conservatives were then the establishment, or at least thought to be, and hence did not need to launch a movement, really. Confusingly, however, these conservatives included everyone from the most corrupt apologists for political machines to the next high-minded defenders of constitutional rectitude. In part, the lumping together was deliberate and an effort to take the latter with the former's base motives. At its best, however, this conservative movement had roots going back to Abraham Lincoln. By and large, it was a legal or constitutional set of thinking, a strength that was also a weakness. Although these conservatives fought courageously against a growing variety of novel assaults on the Constitution, they were usually on the strategic defensive in an era whose main intellectual currents were increasingly hostile to individual rights and limited government. These eminent practitioners were unable to face down the philosophical challenges to the order they loved so well. This sounds like much of our problem today, which is why I love Charles Kesler's new book, The Crisis of the Two Constitutions, from which I'm quoting. There, he writes about the Americanization of conservatism, stating, one might combine criticisms of latter-day traditionalism and libertarianism by saying that a reborn American conservatism, based on the principles of the American Revolution, would teach both morality and freedom, order and liberty, not as a fusion or agglomeration of opposites, but through inferences from the same set of principles. Excuse me. Those principles are the rights of man under the laws of nature. Now, one of the great achievements of the scholars who helped intentionally or not to inspire the contemporary conservative movement was their reopening of the question of natural right or justice. For the first time in perhaps 100 years, it is now possible for us to return to the natural right doctrines of the American founders in an intelligent way, to revive their molding and political enterprise and make it the heart and soul of a new American conservatism. Practically speaking, this means a rediscovery of the moral basis and the moral arguments for Republican government. A restored republic would entail a federal government that is much more limited than the present state, though energetic in pursuit of its limited objects. The inveterate conservative opposition to big government would shift in emphasis from horse calls to get the government out of our wallets and off our backs to a new indictment of big government as an insult or assault to our rights, an offense against our equality, a violation of our Constitution. To be sure, big government has always been a reliable target of conservative denunciation, yet often the grounds of the conservative attack on it have been sandy. A few perfunctory invocations of the 10th Amendment, perhaps, warmed over anger at the unholy expense of it all, some boilerplate about the imperial judiciary. The modern state offends republicanism even more profoundly than it offends federalism, however, and conservatives should reformulate their attacks along more provocative constitutional lines. For example, stressing not only the cost of entitlement programs, but the manner in which they inveigle us into thinking that all our rights flow from government. Or criticizing bureaucracy, not only for its wastefulness and absurdity, but for its despotic tendency to concentrate legislative, executive, and even judicial power into the same experts and intellectuals or unelected hands. Even as economic conservatives ought to acknowledge that morality is essential to limited government, so too religious and social conservatives should recognize that America is in many ways less free than it used to be. We suffer from too much license and not enough liberty. On the one hand, the modern state social programs encourage personal responsibility by socializing its costs. On the other hand, big government narrows personal freedoms essential to republicanism. The right to use and be secure in one's property, to donate money to political campaigns, to count as an equal regardless of race or ethnicity in the eyes of the law. So today's manifold threats to liberty and morality stem mainly from the same source: modern liberalism's rejection of the original American understanding of self-government. Reacting piecemeal to this affront, each faction of the existing conservative movement has seized on an important part of the truth, but there is something missing that can be supplied only by a more American and more political conservatism. Though in some ways conservatism is now in a position to reconnect itself with the constitutionalist doctrines of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, ultimately it is the conservatism of the founders that we are seeking. Their principles will not yield immediate solutions to every public policy issue we should recognize, of course, and admit. For example, the Declaration of Independence will not tell us what to do about Google and Twitter, but their basic principles of justice and constitutional architecture, great word, will be relevant to our most important concerns, always assuming that we have the practical wisdom to apply them rightly. The conservatives of a century ago had one big advantage over us. They saw modern liberalism in its youth, at its most theoretically audacious, and before its projects had become familiar. By rediscovering America's principles, conservatives have it in their power to encounter liberalism afresh, to see it anew and as a whole for the first time in many decades, and thus to learn how radical a departure from the Constitution of the Founders it actually is. Here, in truth, is where something like the principles of the French Revolution took hold of mainstream American progress and did not let it go. In thinking through the crisis of American national identity today, we should keep in mind the opening words of the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths. Usually incorrectly, we emphasize the truths that are held in common, but we must not forget the we who hold them. The American Creed. It is the keystone of American national identity, but it requires a culture to sustain it. The Republican task is to recognize the creed's primacy of the culture's indispensability, and the challenge which political wisdom alone can answer to shake the people that can endure while also living up to its principles. If you want to understand why the left so often attacks our founding, and as I monologued yesterday, even now going so far as in one case trying to cancel Independence Day, and in another just merely tolerating a president who will let us know if we can celebrate in our own backyards and with how many people. If you want to understand the taproot of the hatred of our founding, it is explained by the notion of relativism. You see, relativism, long a part and parcel of progressivism, holds that there is no such thing as absolute truth or absolute right or wrong, only power and temporary or transient preferences. But we were a country whose founders, giving us our founding, declared our existence on the basis of objective and inerrant, permanent truth. That is the philosophical problem the progressives have with our founding. Every other critique or laundry list of condemnations emanates centrifugally from that, whether they know it or not. But, back to Kesler if I might, for all its talk of openness, what is most characteristic of the contemporary left, especially the academy, is its unwillingness to hear of relativism's alternatives. There is a constituency within American universities for diversity in virtually every area except the vital ones. Yet the argument against the radical separation of facts and values must be heard if American education is ever to be able to recapture itself and respect and its purpose. This, of course, calls for the reading of great books, as Allen Bloom and E.D. Hirsch have argued eloquently, but not merely for the reading of great books. It is too easy for such studies to degenerate into their own kind of cultural relativism in which moral and political questions are condescended to from the Olympian heights of intellectual virtue, or rather, of the character of intellectual virtue that remains when practical wisdom is denied its rightful place as part of intellectual perfection. In Aristotle's account, one of his distinctions is between the theoretical wisdom and the practical wisdom, whereas the practical is concerned with one's own good and ignores the relationship between one's own good and the public good. Plato, who did not make such distinctions between theoretical and practical knowledge, understood the quest for wisdom to begin with a question at once practical and theoretical. How shall we live? In short, according to both Plato and Aristotle, that concern, how shall we live, is the highest question of theory and ought to begin with and ultimately return every reflection on one's own situation for the good of society. For if we are serious about how we shall live as a question, if we are serious about what's good for the individual as good, we will be serious about what's good for the public as well. Thus, the reading of great books, although necessary, is not sufficient. They must be read with the beauty of the student's own good as human beings and citizens. They must be read with an eye for something outside tests, for the aim of education is not simply the imparting of facts or the appreciation of great books, but wisdom, uniting theory and practice, knowledge with character and ideas that have consequences. The recognition that the pursuit of knowledge, shorn of its moral and political responsibility, becomes a spiritless game behind the frequent calls in our time for schools to teach merely values. Facts are not enough. Students need something more. The demand has been taken up by both liberal and conservatives, of course, and there's a movement called cultural conservatism, which sprang up a few years ago explicitly to fight relativism by encouraging an attention to values. But to speak of conserving just values is already to make a crucial concession to the relativist position, for values are not serious because values are by definition subjective. To invoke absolute values is to do more than to announce that one feels strongly about them. That the distinction is not merely verbal may be gathered from cultural conservatives' answer to the pointed question why we conservatives value Western civilization. Why do we value Western civilization's values? Well, we often answer because they work. The conservatives' reply, because they work, can easily garner a leftist's reply, what do you mean work? The values of cannibals work very well for them, don't they? Suppose then that the conservative were to say, look, no sane man doubts that the West's traditional values work inasmuch as they produce material prosperity, freedom, peace among the nations. But what of those who despise luxury, who hunger for power, and who crumble at peace imposed on them by the will of other nations? What of those people? The relativist might respond. Do we have an answer? Why shouldn't their values count? To call men like Robespierre or Lenin or Hitler or Mao insane, absent a major refinement, cultural conservatives' argument becomes simply to say that we don't like those men's values. It's not to say they're wrong, it's just that we don't like them. And if a skeptic were to add, suppose that tomorrow the stock market plunges into a deep depression, or that war with Russia or China or North Korea should break out, what then would become of those conservative values? Would we still be able to say Western civilization works? Where do we go to find these virtues or justifications for them? Of course, our founding. Are we aware, for example, of John Adams' letters to his son Charles, written while serving as George Washington's vice president? In one letter to his son, John Adams explained the definition of moral equality, saying this, quote, "It really means little more than that we're all of the same species, made by the same God, possessed of minds and bodies alike, in essence having all the same reason, passions, affections, and appetites. All men are men and not beasts, men and not birds, men and not fish. The infant in the womb is a man, not a lion. All these are men and not angels, men and not vegetables. The equality of nature is a moral equality. Only an equality of rights and obligations is what it speaks of, and nothing more," John Adams said. It is of the utmost importance, then, to help raise our own and our young people's sights from the dehumanized, deracinated, anti-humanizing world of relativism. And the quest for educational reform in it, we would do well to turn to not only embracing the great books, but also to the great exemplars of wisdom with which our country is blessed. To help reclaim our destiny as human beings and as citizens, we need to rediscover the generation that really could claim to be the best and the brightest in American history, at least from the statesman's point of view, the founders of the American Republic. Which is why I hope you can begin to understand the left, the Democratic Party, and indeed the President of the United States that we have right now are trying to cancel Independence Day. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.